Yo, what's going on? Mike from Mike Talk Sports. From 2020 to 2022, Tai Tuivasa went on a 5-fight win streak, and in this win streak, he knocked out the likes of guys like Greg Hardy and Derek Lewis and was an extremely fun and exciting new heavyweight fighter. But now he's 0-2 in his last 2 fights. Let me tell you guys why I'm starting to get really nervous about Tai Tuivasa's career and future in MMA and specifically in the UFC. Now, first and foremost, I completely understand Tai Tuivasa is still only 30 years old, and being a 30-year-old heavyweight in the UFC is still considered to be extremely young. Not only that, it's extremely impressive that he has so many fights under his belt in the UFC at only 30 years old. And to really understand what makes me so nervous about Tai Tuivasa going forward, let's really look back at his UFC career thus far. So Tai Tuivasa started his UFC career at 3-0, having some extremely exciting fights. So the UFC, in classic UFC fashion, wants to rank a really young guy, a really young, up-and-coming, exciting guy like Bam Bam Tai Tuivasa against one of the old legendary veterans in order to try to build Tai Tuivasa's name. And so one of the first great fighters that they paired up against for Tai Tuivasa was JDS, Junior Dos Santos. This fight did not go well, and Tai Tuivasa clearly was at a skill disadvantage and clearly was not ready for this fight yet as he lost to JDS. He ended up going 0-3 after starting his UFC career 3-0. So basically, he went from a 3-0 prospect, undefeated in the UFC, a young heavyweight, to a guy who's on the brink of a UFC release as he was 0-3 in his last 3 fights. In response to this, Tai Tuivasa put his head down and worked. He really worked on his stand-up game to become more of a technical fighter. He started training harder, and you can really see in his fights how his technical boxing ability really improved. He ended up going from 3-0 to 3-3, and then he went on a crazy 5-fight win streak that I alluded to earlier on in the video. And during this 5-fight win streak, the most notable win thus far in that 5-fight win streak was against Dan Hardy, when he knocked Dan Hardy out in spectacular fashion. And as a guy who loves MMA and loves football, I can tell you, because I'm a part of both communities, this fight really had Tai Tuivasa's name explode, because every single football fan who is an MMA fan really wanted to see Greg Hardy, a notorious criminal, get absolutely knocked out. And after the fight, Tai Tuivasa basically said, hey, that's for all of the victims of domestic violence out there. And Tai Tuivasa, after that fight, really changed his career for the better. He had such a positive public persona, and not only was he known as this crazy great knockout artist with a very entertaining fight style, more than that, everyone loves the gentle giant out of the heavyweight divisions. So Tai Tuivasa, really after this Greg Hardy win, was known as the nice guy in the heavyweight division, and still absolutely 100% does have that nice guy mantra, which in my opinion is a really good thing still for Tai Tuivasa. After this, people started to notice a common theme with Tai Tuivasa, which was his shoey. Basically, Tai Tuivasa got a beer and drank it from a shoe and would absolutely kill it. And this really took the MMA community and the internet as a whole by storm, and really went from rooting for Tai Tuivasa as a fun fighter to dying to see Tai Tuivasa win, just because every single person wanted to see Tai Tuivasa kill 10 shoeys after his fight. In my opinion, this extremely positive thing might lead to his downfall. But before we get into why that is, we will touch upon his most famous win, his win up against Derek Lewis. This was an absolute banger, and it was a war on the feet. Tai Tuivasa ended up getting him in the clinch and ended up knocking him out with a crazy clinch elbow in one of the better knockouts and walk-off knockouts in recent heavyweight history. And this is really the moment in time where Tai Tuivasa went from a guy barely scraping by paycheck to paycheck, having to fight every 3 to 4 months just to be able to sustain his living style, to actually creating a huge brand for himself. Tai Tuivasa really branded himself as the guy who is going to kill a bunch of alcohol after his fights. And in my opinion, this was a great thing from a PR perspective and from a value perspective and from a contract negotiation perspective, effective, but in my opinion, this is where Tai Tuivasa has started to get a little bit lazy. So now Tai Tuivasa is 0-2 in his last 2 fights, and at a surface level, this is not a big deal at all. Let's be completely honest. He just straight up lost to 2 guys who simply are better than Tai Tuivasa. I really don't care how dialed in Tai Tuivasa is. I don't think he really ever beats Ciryl Gane. I don't think he ever really beats Sergey Pavlovich. So what's the issue? Why am I starting to get nervous about Tai Tuivasa, a really young heavyweight who just lost to 2 absolute killers, one guy who's already fought for the belt twice and another guy who is about to fight for the belt? What's the issue? Man, first and foremost, I can't help but be bothered by the fact that every single time Tai Tuivasa has been seen in public, really after that Ciryl Gane fight, he's been absolutely trashed. I hate to be that PG mom here on YouTube saying, oh, this fighter shouldn't be drunk all the time. He shouldn't enjoy his life. That's not what I'm saying at all. All I'm saying is he's 30 years old. He's just fighting the who's who of the UFC, and he's finally at a point in his career where realistically the UFC can really use him to prop up everyone else's name. So this is extremely different when he went from 3-0 to 3-3 because he still wasn't a significant name. So the UFC, after him going 0-3, they want to build him back up. So they're giving him extremely favorable matchups. This is the main reason I'm so nervous about Tai Tuivasa, because now that he's 0-2, the UFC, now that he's a big name, they're not doing him any good favors anymore. They're not going to build his name up with some really easy fights, some hand-picked fights for him. I'm making this video because Jailton Almeida just absolutely ran through Rosenstrike, and right after the fight, Almeida called out Tai Tuivasa. If Tai Tuivasa ends up fighting Almeida, let's be completely honest, Almeida absolutely ragdolls him and finishes him in the first round. Tai Tuivasa just does not have the grappling skill that Almeida possesses whatsoever. So now we're looking at an 0-3 Tai Tuivasa, a guy who hasn't trained as hard, a guy whose public image is now just being drunk all the time. And I love Tai Tuivasa, but this just makes me really nervous about his career and where the UFC, a very cynical company, let's be completely honest, a company who loves building off of guys' names, this is a company that is going to feed Tai Tuivasa killers until he's 0-5, 0-6, 0-7 on this crazy fight lose streak. So in order to combat this, in my opinion, I think Tai Tuivasa should just kind of put his head down, not go to the next couple UFC events. Tai Tuivasa seems as though he's at every single UFC fight. And again, that's fun, that's cool. But in my opinion, he should put his head down, train extremely hard, turn down a Jailton Almeida fight. Fuck that, man. Do not fight Jailton Almeida. It is not cowardly for you to not fight him. You've been 0-2 in your last 2 fights, and you just fought some absolute killers. Fight some guys who are close to you in the rankings, but are winnable matchups. In my opinion, Curtis Blades would be a very interesting matchup for Tai Tuivasa. Again, I alluded to his grappling not being great in that Jailton Almeida fight, but in my opinion, Tai Tuivasa has a bit of underrated defensive grappling. And in my opinion, he can maybe do a similar thing to Curtis Blades that Sergey Pavlovich did in knocking him out early in the fight. If not this Curtis Blades fight, I completely understand. And I would like to see Tai Tuivasa face Alexander Volkov next. Again, a really good striker, a gatekeeper of the heavyweight division, if you will. I think he's been pretty underrated by myself and fans as of recently. And so I think he has a pretty good name on him at this point for Alexander Volkov, and it would give Tai Tuivasa a really nice win. If he loses this fight, I just don't know who he can face again. I think he should start looking at guys who are near the bottom of the top 15, if not unranked guys, because I look at everyone else in the top 15 and I go, I'm not too sure what would be a favorable matchup for Tai Tuivasa. Thanks for listening to the video, guys. Are my concerns about Tai Tuivasa warranted, or am I just completely overthinking his career? As a guy who really likes Tai Tuivasa and wants him to succeed, I'm just really trying to look out for the best for him and see him succeed. Thanks for listening to the video, guys.